are these people?
So over the weekend, it was Martin Luther King weekend, and those of you who may not know, Senator, newly minted Senator Raphael Warnock is actually now the pastor of what is MLK's church in Atlanta. And who happens to show up to do a sermon of all weekends is none other than our President Joe Biden. And I said earlier, this is problematic for reasons, which I'll get into. But one of the rare times I'm actually going to read something from mainstream media and NPR, written by Gulia Hayward. Sorry, I totally blanked on her name. Where she states that Biden becomes the first sitting president to deliver a Sunday sermon at MLK's church. Now, keep in the fact that it's first, as she says, I think is very significant, and we'll get to more of a reason for that in a minute. But she continues. Joe Biden delivered a sermon on Sunday at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, becoming the first sitting president to do so at the church where Martin Luther King Jr. was a pastor. I've spoken before Parliament, kings, queens, leaders of the world. I've been doing this for a long time, Biden said. But this is intimidating. King served as a pastor of the historic church until his assassination in 1968 at the age of 39. Georgia Senator Raphael Warnock, who is the church's pastor, invited the president to deliver the sermon on what would have been King's 94th birthday. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a nonviolent warrior for justice who followed the word and the way of his Lord and Savior, Biden said. On this day of remembrance, we gather at Dr. King's church, Ebenezer. During the speech, which lasted for roughly 25 minutes, Biden touched on both King's faith and his commitment to equality. The president said he felt humbled to achieve the historic milestone. He spoke of King's legacy and called the Reverend one of his heroes. But the sermon quickly turned political as Biden discussed economic issues and voting rights. This is a time of choosing of the direct choices we have, Biden continued. Are we a people who choose democracy over autocracy? Prior to the sermon, Biden released a proclamation on Friday reflecting on the holiday and similarly touching on voting rights and healthcare. Biden said his administration is calling on Congress to pass the Don Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. In keeping with Dr. King's campaign for economic justice and the rights of workers, note that my administration is striving to make the American dream a reality for every family, Biden said in the proclamation. During his speech, Biden said that the battle for the soul of this nation continues today. He discussed a range of current affairs, including the recent appointment of the Supreme Court's first Black female justice and the political turmoil in Brazil. Biden concluded his speech by describing a bust of King that currently lies in the Oval Office, reiterating that King is one of his inspirations. There's also another bust in his office, according to Biden, of Rosa Parks. Not sure if that's true, but okay. The president once again asked listeners to continue to work towards the country's progress. Folks, for God's sakes, this is the United States of America, Biden said. There's nothing beyond our capacity if we set our mind to it. Any thoughts, Reef, before I begin to go into Biden a little bit and Warnock as well?
I mean, it's just the fact of pure political theater for while also pissing off the same people you're trying to pander to.
Yeah.
I mean, also anyway, I'm sure we're gonna have some lovely Bidenisms thrown in here too. So,
actually, that is the article. But here's why this is problematic from you could say more of a financial standpoint. You could say. So Biden actually gave a sermon, and he actually gave a sermon, he went political, as he said. There's a reason why there's something called separation of church and state.
Yes.
Because according to the IRS, right? And if you zoom in,
Mm-hmm.
like churches are tax exempt, right?
Yeah.
So under the Internal Revenue Code, all Section 501c3 organizations, that includes churches, right, are
Mm-hmm.
absolutely prohibited from, scroll down a bit, or get rid of your screen.
Oh.
Thank you. I'll bring it up.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Sorry.
All Section 501c3 organizations are absolutely prohibited from directly or indirectly participating in or intervening in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for elective public office. Now, you can argue, I haven't heard the speech, don't care to hear it, but two things that you can kind of say are problematic with this. First of all, the fact that, as you said, I think it's definitely virtual signaling to one, Biden's base, predominantly older Black base, who are pretty much guaranteed voters in Georgia, which is kind of teetering on red and blue at the moment.
Mm.
So the idea that he's doing this, it wasn't, you can argue it wasn't to necessarily give props to Dr. King. It was more of a virtual signal towards voters
Yeah.
come next year. Just to be like, hey, vote for, hey, I came to MLK's church and I gave a sermon. Vote for me. I'm not going to do shit for you, but vote for me anyway. So that's just kind of the thought that I had, in terms of Biden, which is significant that he is the first one.
Yeah.
And this, according to the IRS, is probably why, in terms of this is being problematic and, kind of overstepping his bounds, as president to be able to do something like this, given that this is a church and in very fact of MLK's church at that. So I thought it was very significant that I heard some murmurs of this because that's immediately what I thought of being in church and actually having pastors who said directly to the congregation, especially like back in 2016, that they weren't going to talk about anything political in regards to anything of their sermons. I like shout out to my former pastors who made that very clear that that's what they're not going to do. But the fact that Warnock himself, so don't worry, I'm not forgetting about you, Warnock. I'm getting at you now. The fact that he did this, as far as, kind of, again, more virtual signaling to his congregation, like, hey, I got the president for you. Obviously, it's going to get a lot of press. Obviously, it's going to get a lot of attention, and it's just a way for his congregation to say, oh, Biden spoke at our church. God bless you, whatever else it was like. So, look, I grew up in church, so.
Yeah, like I know that lady. I know that lady you're doing.
Right. So, but, and not to say I've studied Dr. King, but especially being a teacher and more particularly, with preschool, having the opportunity to even right now to talk to my students about Dr. King right now and having to think about this a little bit more in depth. It's interesting that whenever people talk about Dr. King, it's always in terms of, oh, he was a peaceful man. Oh, he was in church. Oh, he wanted equality for everybody, all that. Even as far as the children's books that I read kind of mention all of that, which I think is fine for kids. But I think many of many of our audience knows there's a more radical side to Dr. King, especially post I Had a Dream speech, where he goes into the issues of capitalism and our government in terms of their responsibility in terms of Black liberation, which he talked about very frequently up until his death. That is almost never mentioned in mainstream media and certainly not in the mainstream of consciousness as far as what we know about Dr. King. And had Warnock, I'm sure Warnock did his homework. I'm sure Warnock knows about this, but he failed not to kind of mention that or has promoted this at all, to my knowledge, in regards to Biden being in office. Where if Warnock was being more of a badass, he probably would have played something like this. So if you go ahead and roll this video, please.
Yes, sir.
Tired of marching for something that should have been mine at birth. I have a dream.
That dream that I had that day has at many points turned into a nightmare.
We have stood up for nonviolence with all of our hearts, and those who will make this peaceful revolution impossible will make a violent revolution inevitable.
I have no sympathy at all for destroying your own communities.
I think we've got to see that a riot is the language of the unheard.
Rioting is not protesting. No, it's not what Dr. King or John Lewis taught.
Riots are caused by nice, gentle, timid white moderates who are more concerned about order than justice.
I am a supporter of the death penalty without the racial justice provision in it.
Who can always say to the Negro, you're pushing things too fast, wait for a more convenient season.
I also don't think we should get too far ahead of ourselves on dealing with police reform.
Something must be done to end this kind of unnecessary abuse of police power and what we see as outright police brutality.
President Trump says that you want to defund the police. Do you?
No, I don't. I think they need more help. This is about protecting everybody across the board.
A Democratic president wants 100,000 cops.
We've got some difficult days ahead, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Yeah. So if Warnock wanted to be, as I said, if Warnock wanted to be really petty, he would have played this.
Yeah.
Honestly, but it kind of, and this video is from Too Far Left. Shout out to them for making this video, but I think it truly shows the dichotomy of what Biden says that Dr. King was about versus what, he actually spoke on, which I think is very interesting. So I don't want to get too much more into Dr. King because we are going to talk about him later with your segment at the end of the show. But I did find this, which I thought was interesting. So this is a thread from Angela Rye. Those of you who know Angela Rye, she is a lawyer, kind of a shit lib. She's been on the Breakfast Club many times, but sometimes, more often than not, she does have good takes on things. And I saw this over the weekend, so I thought it was interesting enough to pull up and share. So if you remove your screen, please.
Yeah.
So Angela Rye tweeted out on Monday, I had a dream that one day the world will also recognize that Dr. King said, whenever Pharaoh wanted to prolong the period of slavery in Egypt, he had a favorite formula of doing it. What was that? He kept the slaves fighting among themselves. Hold on. Yeah. But whenever the slaves get together, something happens in Pharaoh's court, and he cannot hold the slaves in slavery. When the slaves get together, that's the beginning of getting out of slavery. Now let us maintain unity. Now the other thing we have to do is this. Always anchor our external direct action with the power of economic withdrawal. Now, we are poor people individually. We are poor when you compare us with white society in America. We are poor. Never stop and forget that collectively, that means all of us together, collectively, we are richer than all the nation in the world, with the exception of 9. Did you ever think about that? after you leave the United States, Soviet Russia, Great Britain, West Germany, France, and I could name the others, the Negro collectively is richer than most nations of the world. We have an annual income of more than $30 billion a year, which is more than all the exports of the United States and more than the national budget of Canada. Did you know that? That's power right there if we know how to pool it. So this was the speech he gave. I see the Promised Land during the Memphis sanitation workers strike and the day before he was killed.
Mm-hmm.
So the peaceful, like meek, passive Dr. King really doesn't exist in terms of what most people think of him.
Yeah.
So like I said, you're going to talk a little bit more about him in depth. But again, the fact that, as I said in the show notes, that he basically desecrated his church, because I'm sure MLK, either one or two things, would not have allowed him to come in that church, or if he did, would have had some words for someone like Biden to come in there and kind of speak all this virtual signaling. Again, the idea, like he talked about voting, and yet we vote for things as far as universal health care and all these other progressive issues that he's not giving us. And Warnock is just basically going along with it for his own political career. So he basically went with his party instead of his congregation, in terms of having someone who has been the means of their suffering, allowing to speak in his church. So basically both of them are shit for that, but more so Warnock for allowing that to happen, given I'm sure Warnock is intelligent enough to know how Biden is, and yet he still chose to invite him into that church anyway.